Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Ryan. As the DM for our group of gamers, I thought it would be helpful to maybe put out a video with my own unique perspective on being a DM, especially for people who are maybe wanting to get into it. I've noticed it seems to be a trend lately where more and more people are getting into Dungeons and Dragons lately, which is fantastic. That's a great thing. So I think that especially in 2024, there are just great new ways for people to dive into being a DM for their group of players. And frankly, you don't have to have even played before. If I'm going to be honest with you guys, some people will say, no, you have to have at least played a full campaign of D&D or a session or two. I don't think you even have to do that, quite honestly. I will tell you that I DM'd my first campaign after I had only ever played a single session of D&D, which lasted about 2 hours. It's a very short one-off campaign. But I was like immediately hooked, and so I got the handbook. I read through all the rules, cover to cover. I watched a bunch of campaigns, listened to podcasts of people playing D&D, and got a really good feel for the cadence of things. And once I knew the rules and knew what DMing sort of entailed, that's when I brought it to my group of friends. Was like, hey guys, can I take you through a campaign? They're like, yeah, sure, because we've always wanted to play D&D together. And I was like, well, I'll run a campaign. You guys will do it. And they were totally in. So we just took off and hit the ground running, all of us pretty well novices at the time. So you don't need to have a whole bunch of experience in order to be a DM. You don't even need a lot of resources, and I'll get to that in a second. But this video is really designed to be a bit of an intro to DMing for people who are wanting to get into it. And I think it might be sort of unobtainable, inaccessible, and I'm here to tell you it's not. It's very obtainable. It's very accessible. Let's dive in. I'll start with basics, and then we'll get to more advanced concepts later in the video, and I will timestamp every topic on the slider below, so you can just click to anything that you think sounds important or you want to revisit later, just for your convenience. Let's dive in. Number one, this one probably will be the most obvious one, but you need to know the rules. You could buy the handbook. Maybe you're like, I'm not sure if this is something I want to do long term, so I don't want to spend 50 or 60 bucks on a handbook. That's fine. You can look up the rules online. There's a lot of online resources that'll teach you the basics of how to play D&D, but there's also great YouTube resources out there too. There's a YouTuber called Don't Stop Thinking. He's got a full playlist on his YouTube channel that is dedicated to how to play Dungeons and Dragons. So I'll put a link to that in the description for you for your navigating convenience. But anyways, you're going to need to know how combat works, right? Like what's the difference between rolling to see if they hit and then rolling for damage? How do armor classes work? You need to know how skill checks work, because players are going to want to use their skills, whether it's persuasion or performance or arcana or lock picking, all of those things. You need to know how those work. You're going to need to know how initiative works and keeping track of initiative order. And you're also going to need to know how to read stat blocks. If you don't know what a stat block is, a stat block is basically an information sheet that details things like a character's hit points or a monster's hit points, things like that. The handbook has, I don't know if I can legally show you pictures of the handbook or not, but that's a stat block right there. So it'll tell you what's the armor class. If you have this, if for example, I was going to throw an owl into the initiative, I need to know what its initiative bonus is, which is +1. So I'm going to roll a d20 and add 1 to it. How many hit points does it have? Well, it has 1. Anyways, you're going to need to know how to read a stat block. All of that information is very easy to find. Like I said, just Google how to play D&D. There'll be a ton of guides out there for you. So familiarize yourself with the basic rules. Topic number 2, what are you going to need? What resources are you physically going to need to invest in if you're going to be a DM? Okay, I'm going to be honest with you guys up front. The very first campaign I ever ran, I had zero investment in actual physical things I went out and bought, other than obviously dice. You're gonna need dice, obviously, all of them. But other than that, you don't actually physically need anything. You can actually run a full campaign in what we like to call the theater of mind, where you are describing with your words where your players are, what the space around them looks like. And as long as you have, this is the one thing that you're gonna need other than dice, is a notebook and a pen. That's all you need as a DM, just to run a very basic theater of the mind campaign. Because you can just kind of, if the room is circular, just draw a circle and your players walk in and you say, there are 2 people against the far wall and they're shooting you with crossbows. And they're like, oh shoot, well I'm going to run up to them. Just be like, okay, well it's a 30-foot room. Let's call it a 30-foot wide room. What's your movement speed? I've got 30 movement speed. Cool, you run all the way up to him and hit him with your sword. So as long as you are keeping track of this stuff, just in the theater of mind, you can get along just fine. I do recommend that one of your first investments be the Dungeons and Dragons Player Handbook, 5th edition. If you want to take things even further, you can buy the Monster Manual because you're going to want to have access to a ton of stat blocks, because one of the things as a DM you're going to need to do, even if you're getting pre-made campaigns, you're going to need to change them, okay? Because maybe you're like, this sounds like a great campaign, but it's scaled to a party of 4 where they're all at level 10. But you're like, well, my party is a party of 3 players and they're all at level 5. Well, if you throw them into that campaign, they're going to get destroyed in the very first combat section because there are enough combatants in that space to overwhelm them, because it was designed for 4 players, not 3. And they're going to be hitting extra hard because they were scaled to players at level 10, not level 5. You get the idea. So you're going to need to be able to swap combatants in and out to balance these encounters for your party specifically. One of the best ways to do that is to have the Monster Manual where you can look inside of it and say, okay, well, the campaign I'm running has a bandit chief here. How do I downscale that to just being a regular bandit or a marauder or whatever it may be? And so you bring them down a bit. So having the Monster Manual is going to definitely come in handy as a DM. The next thing you're going to need is maps. And you don't necessarily have to have maps for your players, but as a DM, you're going to need to have a mapped out space for them to play in and that you're keeping track of. That's kind of your job. Now, I actually like to use Canva. I pay for Canva, which is a service online, to where I can just make my own hand-drawn maps with assets and resources there on their program. Because I like to homebrew encounters. Yeah, this is off the cuff, but I'll show you. I like to homebrew encounters, so a lot of times I'll just whip these up in Canva and save them to my computer as I'm running the campaign. It's just like, here's the space they're going to be fighting in. And this is like, sometimes I'll have an outward facing one where I can just show them real quick if we're running a campaign virtually. I'll be like, here's the space you're in. Here's just a simple grid to give you a frame of reference for, these are each 5 feet. This is what's going on. But then I'll also have my own DM facing version of the same map where I can see the traps, I can see the ambushing person up here, stuff like that. Got a map of the tavern and the characters that are in it. And that's not complex stuff, like it's not fancy, it doesn't look great. It's just designed really to be a tool for me to keep track of my players, where they're going and what they're doing. So maps, definitely helpful to have, even if you just scratch them down by hand in a notepad for yourself to keep track of where your players are at in an encounter. That's something you're going to need. And the last thing you're going to need, obviously, you're going to need players. I would say, realistically, you should have at least 3. You can do it with 2. You can even do a campaign with 1 if you're feeling bold and adventurous. There's just 2 of you and you want to goof around, that's fine. But I would say for your best campaigns, you need to have at least 3 players. It's 3 different perspectives that they're bringing, 3 different skill sets that they're bringing to the table. They can overcome more kinds of obstacles if there are more of them with diverse skill sets. So locked doors, strength checks, arcana checks, healing up options. Those become much more diversified with a larger group. The next thing I want to talk about is, what are your goals as a DM? Because this is going to dictate everything that you do, every choice you make, every encounter you design. All of it comes back to a core list of goals that you have as a DM. And sometimes, truth be told, the rules of D&D will be superseded by your goals as a DM, because there are actually you'll find this pretty quickly as a DM, but there's going to be times where your players are going to come face to face with a situation where the rules say one thing should happen, but for the sake of their fun, for the sake of the goals you have as a DM, you need to ignore 1 or 2 rules in order to get the desired outcome. We'll talk about that later in the video. But what are those goals? Let's lay them down. So I have 5 core goals as a DM personally that I have come up with. I have my own list that I refer back to anytime I'm running a campaign or designing encounters. I always fall back on these 5. The first one is obvious. Goal number 1, we want our players to have fun, right? Within reason. Obviously, we're going to put some limitations on them, but our primary goal is, this is a social game. We want to laugh. We want to have a great time. We want to just have fun together. And so we want to make sure that whatever we do with our campaigns, fun is always on the table. Goal number 2, we want to let our players tell their own stories, okay? A lot of DMs make this mistake of assuming that you are the storyteller, right? From start to finish, you've already dictated this full narrative that's going to take place, your characters are just going to go through that narrative. That's not really what the goal of a DM is. Your goal as a DM is to set up a space, have a narrative, have NPCs, have a clear goal in mind, but your players are really the ones that are going to be telling their own stories. So it's a cooperative experience where you're telling a story with your players, not to your players. So remember that. You're not telling them, you're not telling a story to them, telling a story with them. So you want to make sure that you're not scripting too much of what they do. So for example, in a campaign I was recently running, my players experienced a memory loss scenario where the events of the previous night were lost on them. They kind of woke up in a fog and they're trying to retrace their steps and understand what happened. Well, one of the things that happened is one of our characters managed to seduce a particular woman. And so what I would do is there were moments where it's like suddenly it comes flashing back to you. You remember what you did in order to get this girl to fall for you. And I'm like, what was it? You know, instead of telling him, here's what you did, I then tee him up and say, how did your character do this? And he was like, well, I'm not a charismatic character. So it really made him think. He's like, I'm a ranger. Oh, okay. So here's what I did. We were at the bar and I said, okay, well, whoever can hit this shot buys a round of drinks for the other. And so he pulled off an incredible shot with his bow on a certain item that was hanging on the wall, and she was really impressed. And so he got to tell his own story. I didn't dictate it for him. I set up the scenario. I maybe laid down the outcome, but how he got there was up to him. Goal number 3, we want to create a playground for our players to play in. That means compelling characters and compelling locations, interesting locations. I'll get to more on that in a minute. Goal number 4 is that we want to have a nice balance between combat and narrative role play. So we don't want it to be all combat because we don't get any character development there. We don't want it to be all narrative because then they're going to get fatigued by words pretty quickly. Again, more on that in a minute. And finally, goal number 5, we want to put our players in positions where they really do need to wrestle with their own characters. We want to challenge them to roleplay, right? So now let's move on to the next section of the video. How do we accomplish those goals? What are some clear ways that we can get those things done? So goal number 1 was we wanted our players to have fun. Well, how do we do that? Well, you're going to need to be flexible, and there's something that we as DMs like to call the rule of cool. You may hear that term thrown around from time to time. What is the rule of cool? Sometimes your players are going to suggest that they do something really outlandish. It doesn't make sense. It might even bend some of the rules, but you realize it's not going to hurt the narrative if they do this. If anything, it might just make their character feel, a little bit more alive. So you say, you know what, let's just roll with it. Okay, that's fine. Just give me an acrobatics check and we'll see if you pull that off. Something like that. Be flexible. Let them have fun with their characters. Let them be creative and express themselves. And you may have to adjust your narrative in order to fit this new fun thing that they're trying to do. A big part of being a good DM is being flexible and being able to, on the fly, just change around what's happening because you had an idea about how this conversation was going to go, but your players had a different direction in mind, and maybe they weren't even vibing with what you were doing. And if you had gone through with what you had planned, they may not have resonated with it at all, but you can read the room and understand, hey, they're going a different direction and they're really excited about it. Let's change things up. Let's let them have their fun. We said goal number 2 was to let your players tell their own stories. Kind of like my example with our ranger friend. You're going to allow them to dictate what their players are doing. You don't want to be the one that's controlling what their players do. If at all possible, you never want to control the players. Don't put words in their mouths. Don't make them do actions unless it's really necessary for the narrative. But for the most part, we want our players controlling their characters. What they say, what they do, the choices they make. That means that we have to have contingencies, and we need to have contingencies for our contingencies because you just can't predict every wild, wacky thing that your players might come up with in the moment. But you need to at least think ahead and say, well, they're either going to go along with this or they're not. If they don't go along with it, what's my plan B? If they do go along with it, here's where we go. So you need to have contingencies because as we give our players the freedom to tell their own stories, that will inevitably derail ours. Goal number 3 was that we wanted to create a playground for our players to play in. And part of that means getting a little creative with it. Maybe if they're in a tavern, don't just have it be a loud, boisterous place. Put some extra encounters in there. Maybe there's a table nearby where people are challenging an ogre to arm wrestling. So your brute guy can be like, drinking his ale down and be like, I'm going over there. I'm gonna wrestle him for some cash, and maybe he can make 10 gold off of a bet or something. I've had it before where one of the performers on the stage at this tavern broke a string on their lute, and so our bard was like, I'm gonna step up and I'll play instead so that the music can stay alive. Stuff like that. Let it be a breathable space, a real living and organic space for them to hop into. Especially at the very beginning of a campaign, this is a great place to allow for things like that to happen, because it lets your players really take their time kind of falling into role play, falling into their characters. If you kick things off immediately with narrative and exposition, and here's your goal of the campaign that you need to go towards, it's really easy for them to just overlook a lot of details because they're focused now solely on the goal and less on who the character is. So we want to put them in a situation where they can sort of flex their wings a little bit, and kind of have a minute to get into their clothing as a playable character. The next goal was that we wanted a good balance between combat and narrative roleplay. Part of having good balance between those two things is finding ways of slipping narrative into things that aren't just monologues, right? It's really easy to be like, well, how do I convey this story? Well, I'll have an NPC step up and talk in this 4-minute monologue where it's just you, the DM, speaking to your party in character. And they're going to go, they're going to tune out, even if you feel like you've made the most compelling backstory for this character. When I was a child and I descended from the peaks and the people of the city accepted me warmly, you're going to go on and on and on and on. And you think this is a great backstory, and they are going to tune out. So find ways of taking that narrative and breaking it apart and slipping it into other things except for just monologues. Maybe they discover notes on desks. Maybe they overhear, they're eavesdropping, and they overhear a conversation at a table nearby. And you can trust your players to start piecing together these breadcrumbs that you're leaving for them. Trust that they're smart enough to latch onto them and put it together like a puzzle and get an understanding for the lore that you're trying to communicate, the story that you're trying to tell them. Instead of just having a character stand and deliver, here is my story. I call these things breadcrumbs. I love doing this in campaigns where I slip in breadcrumbs that point to this larger narrative that's happening outside of just the individual encounter they're in right then and there. Because then later in the campaign, when something happens that I hinted towards 2 hours ago in our session, they can be like, oh my gosh, that's that thing that we saw back there, that's what this was about. And so it really makes them feel like they're in this organic world, not just a scripted sequence of events, but that there's this larger narrative that's being told and they're wrapped up in it. Our last goal was that we really wanted to challenge our players. Sometimes we do that by having very real stakes in the campaign. Their actions have consequences. We also want to force tough decisions on our players. If, for example, you have a character who is moral, lawful, good, maybe you need to present them with a dilemma where there's no good choice, where they have two options and both of them seem like the right thing to do, but at the expense of the alternative. And so putting them at a fork in the road where their lawful good nature, where they're like, I just always choose the good thing. It's like Rachel and Harvey Dent, making Batman choose. Who are you going to go save? It's moments like that where they have to make a decision, and there's a reward for the one that they make, but there's also a consequence for the one that they don't make. And then it's other things like you want to challenge your players. Like, for example, you have a bard in your party and you say, all right, well, I'm going to put you in a situation where I'm putting you on a stage with an instrument and a crowd is looking at you and they're saying, sing us a song or tell us a tale. And then I don't say anything. I just look at the player. I'm like, what is it? What do you say? What do you do? What do you sing? And so it's really this opportunity where they get to live in the shoes of their character and say, oh, well, I sing a song and it goes like this. I ordered a drink in Waterdeep, sat in the corner at the window seat. The barmaid came, she was quite the sight. Her rack was huge and her ass was tight. Something like that. Make them just, okay, do it, Or you can even put your cleric in dialogue with an NPC who's having a crisis of faith and give them the opportunity to be like, okay, here's your chance. You're a cleric. You're a priest. Give them a sort of pep talk about their faith journey. What are you going to say to them? That's what keeps your players engaged, because then when the session ends, they're going to think back and they'll be like, I could have said this. I should have done that instead. Or if I had done this. That's what we want them feeling, because now they're going to take those experiences into your next session. It's going to refine the way that they play their character. The next thing we need to talk about is NPCs. Okay, so your players, they have to think about one character, the character that they are playing. Okay, what motivates them, what's their backstory, all that stuff. You as a DM, you got to think of like 20, maybe more than that, depending on the size of the campaign that you're running. You need to be familiar with these characters enough that when your players interact with them, you're not like flipping through like, oh, let me find, yes, Zordak the dwarf. He is, you know what I mean? You need to have a familiarity with these characters, because you don't want to take your players. It's not at all a bad thing to have to refer to notes and just asking for your players to have a little patience with you while you get your bearings. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you can keep it as organic as possible, that's great, because it's going to give them this feeling of a real organic world, and you're not going to be pulling them out of it every now and then just so you can look over notes. But it can be really hard, I've learned, to force your players to develop a connection to an NPC. Like, we want them to have a meaningful connection with their NPCs that we create, but don't expect them to fall in love with that character immediately. And forming a connection to a character isn't always about liking them. It could be about really hating a character, and that could be a motivating factor for players too. But if writing compelling characters gets complicated, it gets hard for you, because it can be difficult. You have to manage 20 characters. Oh my gosh, I have to come up with extensive backgrounds. Try to keep it simple, because there's another way to look at this. Sure, maybe have a handful of really compelling characters that are well written, but it's a lot easier to work with a character that just has a one clear motivating force. For example, this is a character that I made. There are one motivating factor is that they will do absolutely anything for cheese. It's memorable, it's silly, but it's simple, and it makes role-playing as a DM, role-playing that character a lot easier when you know the one thing that they have in mind. Maybe their one motivating factor is their attachment to another character. And so every choice they will make is what's going to benefit this person more. Another thing you can do is flip this scenario on its head and say, instead of let's make a character that our players are going to feel attached to, let's flip that on its head and say, let's make a character that's going to feel an attachment to our players. For example, and this is really easy to do. For example, in the campaign I'm running right now, our players ended up at a farm, and I had our bard character entrance some animals, and one of them just really latched onto her, and it's a ram. And he is a very simple character. He has no voice lines because he's a ram and they don't have speaks with animals. And his one motivating goal in life is that he will defend this bard to the death. He is obsessed with this bard, and it is kind of like, I basically consider it sassy Moodang, Moodang, the pygmy hippo, except if Moodang was a sassy sheep instead with horns. And that's who they are, right? And they lash out at anyone and everyone around this bard character and just kind of stands proud, like, this is my human, you know what I mean? And it's such a simple character, but immediately, because that character felt an attachment to the player, she's like, oh, this is my baby now. She named him Ramstein. She takes him everywhere. When she goes shopping, she buys him things. And it's adorable. It's such a simple concept, but it made for a compelling character that's now a core part of the narrative that's being told. And it's a sheep. So start with something basic. Another character that I had was just an orphan girl who had a very strong connection to our players. As soon as she saw this group of adventurers, she was like, that's so cool. She's really infatuated with the idea of being an adventurer. And so what I did is I just had this little girl compliment them a lot, tell the bard player, you're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. I had her make like homemade string bracelets for our ranger. And so it's just a really simple character. But because her one motivator is these people are really cool, and I want these people to know that I think they're really cool. That's just how simple she is written. But they adore this character because of it, because the connection started with her to them, not them to her. And that then opens up some really interesting doors, because if I put that character, don't tell them I'm saying this, but if I put that character in danger, now that combat scenario is dramatically different, because they have this emotional investment in the outcome of this fight. It's not just baddies show up, let's smack the baddies around. It's these baddies showed up and grabbed this girl and are holding her with a dagger. Now they're like, oh, no, you know what I mean? Let's move on to the next part of the video, something every good DM needs to be able to do, and that's think about non-combat related challenges. So another great way to challenge your players is to throw in the occasional challenge that isn't directly tied to combat. This could be an NPC that will only offer up the information that your players want if you're willing to outsmart them in a card game and beat them in a cunning card game. Maybe it's a brute, like I said, who just wants to have an arm wrestling competition, best 2 out of 3, my strength versus your strength. So you want to send in your brawler. Maybe you create a puzzle where there are hidden switches that need to be flipped in the correct sequence, and your players need to piece it together. Maybe it's a trap that's been laid for your party. Maybe they need to save people from a burning building, and it's a challenge that you've created for them. You're like, there's a certain amount of time you have before this building collapses. And as they're going into the fire and finding people to drag out, maybe a beam falls over, maybe part of the ceiling collapses and one of them takes a little bit of damage, and they're racing against the clock to see how many people they can save before this thing comes down. It's challenges like that that are really going to engage your players on a deeper level outside of just combat. And then it's also going to present them with opportunities to use the skills that they've been learning, the abilities they've been unlocking as they level up, and they're selecting the spells and the abilities they're going to take forward in this campaign. Now suddenly you're giving them an opportunity to use those things outside of combat. Maybe your mage decides, well, I'm going to use my gust of wind to push the smoke away so that I can see into this room and see if there's someone in here that I need to save. Stuff like that. So allow them to have this playground where they can utilize these skills and these abilities that they've been working on and decided are important to their character's core identity. That's not just combat related. It's also going to make them feel a stronger connection to their characters. Circling back to combat, the next part of the video, let's talk about combat variation. It can be hard to come up with unique encounters for your players to play through. There's a pretty good chance that your players, you'll find, if there's not a lot of variety in your combat encounters, if it's just bad guys show up, you need to take them down, you'll probably find that they end up using the same abilities, the same approaches, combat encounter after encounter after encounter. For example, my current group of players, don't tell them I'm talking about this, my current group of players they have a lot of AoE abilities, and they've been using those a lot when they get into combat to try to lock down multiple opponents at once, and they're stacking their AoE abilities. Well, I designed an encounter that's combat related. That's in a very narrow room. So if they were to put one of their AoE things down, one of their abilities down, it'll likely hit them too. So we're trying to take that off the table, force them to be a little bit more creative. I have a counter with enemies behind it. And then from the top of the counter to the ceiling are these metal rods that go vertically up to the ceiling. So you can't just hop the counter. The only way to get in is through a reinforced locked door. So we need to either use thieves' tools or a strength check to get that door out of the way. The combatants on the inside of this walled off area are shooting over the counter and through the rods with crossbows, and then at the end of their turn, they hide behind things like flipped over tables and barrels that are behind the counter. So it's really going to force my players to be a little bit more creative. Okay, how are we going to handle this situation? They're probably going to want to go around to the door, but I have a trap on the floor in front of the door. Will they perceive it? I'm not sure. Also, there's going to be an ambush where a large brute character with a big shield is going to come lumbering down the steps behind whatever player gets to the door first. And this new variable is going to come into combat late and shake things up, be a new variable that I throw on the table. On top of that, don't ask, it's part of the story, but the guys in the corner are in a jail cell, and one of the guys behind the counter is going to pull a lever to open up the jail cell, and then they're all going to come running out because these men who are in that cell are obsessed with our bard. It happened earlier in the story. You had to be there. But I'm treating them as difficult terrain. And some DMs would be like, no, that's not right. They would be non-hostile NPCs that are now in the initiative order. I'm not doing that. It makes things more complicated. They're now I'm treating them as an AoE of difficult terrain as they swarm the bard, and she's trying to do combat with all these guys trying to hang on her every word. So now I have an encounter that's unlike the other encounters that have been walk into the room, bad guys appear, we roll for initiative, we duke it out. Now, there's more variables in play. There's a trap. There's a walled off area where you're receiving damage from. There's an ambusher. There's difficult terrain. All of these extra variables make the combat feel different and unique and memorable. Next part of the video, part 8, know when to say no to your players. Sometimes your players are just they're gonna think up some crazy things, right? Really random offbeat things that you did not predict, you did not see coming. And sometimes you're gonna hear them suggest something and you're gonna be like, I didn't even think about that, but that makes perfect sense. So you just need to roll with it. Gotta just learn how to say, okay, that's what we're doing now, and modify your narrative accordingly. But other times it's just the things they're going to suggest aren't going to make sense given the context, right? Maybe you just meet the final boss of the campaign and he's in the middle of like introducing himself, and your warrior's like, I'm gonna punch him. Nat 20. Okay, I actually did just roll a nat 20 for the record. Just throwing that out there. Anyways, he's like, I rolled a nat 20. And you're like, dude, come on. I'm just trying to introduce the final boss to you. So you could just say no, or you could just roll with it and be like, okay, you launch off your feet and you put more force behind this punch than you've ever put before in your life. And you think this is going to be the one. And then there's a flash of movement. Suddenly you realize he has moved. He's grabbed your wrist. He twists it down, turns your back to him, and shoves you back to your party and just shakes his head like, is this guy for real? Just learn how to say no. Maybe your bard, they come into contact with a literal god. And your bard's like, I seduced the god. Nat 20. That was a 3. Nat 20, let's go. And you're like, the DC to seduce this god is 50. That ain't happening. By the way, side note, if you're brand new to DMing, DC means difficulty class, and it's the value that you put behind an action or an obstacle for your players to overcome. So if, for example, they walk up to a door and it's stuck and they decide to roll a strength check to try and pry the door open, you've decided that this is going to be a pretty simple task to do. You just set a DC of 10. So they roll their D20, your warrior rolls a 15, he's got it. But he also has like a +4 to strength rolls anyways, so that would have been a 19. Maybe you want to say, okay, this is hard, I'm going to put it at 15. And so your warrior rolls, got a 7, adds 4, can't get it done. So you can control how difficult these tasks are going to be. Don't make all of them layups, make some of them challenging, because if your warrior fails, maybe your rogue has a different idea of something they want to try. Side tangent, sorry. Also say your player's going to come up with some really weird stuff. Sometimes let them have it. But if it's going to derail the narrative or it doesn't make sense in the context, say no. 2 final things before we wrap up the video. The next question is, should we kill our players? Is it okay to kill your players in the campaign? This is a tough one. Different DMs would handle this differently, I think. For me personally, when I run my campaigns, I think that a total player kill, a full death for a player, should always be on the table. Why? Because it actually helps with roleplay when the threat of death is real. They won't just walk into a room with 20 enemies and be like, yup, let's just go for it. Let's roll for initiative. I take a shot at one of them. They're gonna die. And since they know they could die when they walk into a room, since they know it's impossible to fight all 20 of these guys up in the rafters looking down at them, and they've barred the door behind them, they're gonna die. Now, combat's not an option. They enter into negotiations and dialogue with a certain protagonist or a certain antagonist in the room instead. So when player death is an option, it makes for better role play. It also stops your players from doing something stupid, like we get cornered on a bridge, we're in the middle of combat, one of them says, I'm going to jump off the bridge to escape combat. It's okay to tell them, just be like, listen, if you do that, this bridge is very high up. I'm just going to tell you right now, because of the fall damage, you will perma-die. I mean, your character will just flat out be dead. No revivify, no nothing. You're dead when you hit the ground. And so then they're probably going to be like, oh, okay, well, I don't do that then. But if the threat of death is real, then the game feels more real. The experiences have more weight to them. They matter more. Not only that, but if you've been doing the campaign for a while, and your player comes to a moment where they decide that an act of heroism that gets their player killed is the way that they want to wrap up the narrative for their player, for their character, then let them have it. Maybe we've done 6 sessions and they feel like this is a good conclusion for the character they've been playing, and they think that this act of heroism is a great way for them to go out, a meaningful death for their character. Let them have it. And then they can rejoin the next session with a brand new player character that they've come up with. And that can be very exciting for them too. And the last thing I want to talk about in today's video, I know it's been kind of a long one, but there's a lot to cover when it comes to DMing. But the last thing I want to cover is this question of, is it okay to lie to your players? Another tricky topic, honestly, in different DMs have strong feelings about this one, but I'm going to give it to you the way I see it. I'm going to be honest with you guys, okay? I try to always be honest as a DM about my rolls, whether it's do I hit, how much damage do I do, about the difficulty classes of certain activities. I try to be honest about those things and not lie. But I think there are times where you should lie, and there are times where I have lied. This player handbook it's the rule book, right? And we follow this 99% of the time, but there are going to be moments where this is going to ruin the experience for your players. Sometimes they're just going to have bad rolls. And there are times where our goals that we listed earlier in the video, we want them to have fun above all else. In order to accomplish that goal, sometimes we have to kick this to the curb in a certain moment or in a result of a certain roll. For example, I remember one session, one of our players was having a frustrating night. Everything that they had tried to do with rolling for their skill checks was not going their way. They had failed. Or a couple hours into the session, you could tell that they're feeling a little discouraged, not having as much fun as everybody else, and they came to a moment where their skills mattered, and they rolled for another skill check to see if they could remove a pretty sizable obstacle in the way of the party. And when he rolled, the difficulty class for this obstacle was one higher than his ultimate roll was. So he tells me, here's what I got. Does that do it? And I could have been honest and said, unfortunately, no. But in the moment, I was reading the room and I thought, this guy needs a win. And I said, that just covers it. You managed to remove the obstacle. Everyone cheered. He was happy again. He felt like his character was contributing to the campaign. He did something of value to everybody. And it got him right back into it. And he was having fun. Goal number one, gotta have fun. So yes, sometimes it's okay to lie to players if you feel that a different outcome would make for a more enjoyable D&D session for your players. Okay, that's going to do it for the video, folks. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you as I go from being a D&D player and DM into a new space of maybe trying to make some helpful and informative content. I would love to do more stuff on this channel, such as giving you access to my homebrewed campaigns. Part of that means making some better outward-facing resources other than just my sloppily thrown together maps and stuff that I've made on Canva. So if that's something that you would be interested in, let me know in the comments if you're like, yeah, because I've got short 2-hour campaigns. I've got like 6-hour one-off campaigns that can be great for like 2 or 3 sessions. And I've got a full-blown, likely 20-hour campaign that we're working through right now. And I can do stuff like that as well. So if that's something you want, is to have access to some of those campaigns and see what those are about, let me know in the comments below. And I would love to actually start recording some of our campaigns that I have with my friends and editing them and putting them here on the channel as well, so that you can enjoy our sessions from a viewer perspective as well. If that sounds good, then leave a like on the videos. It's the best free way to support the content right here on YouTube, and I hope to catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.